Today is April 15th, 2019, and we're going to interview Mrs. Helen O'Flanagan Durian. Nice to have you here with us this morning.
Thank you
for coming. Tell me a little bit about your parents and where you came from, where they came from, and
my mother and father were both lived in Philadelphia. My mother was born in Germany, but they moved to Philadelphia. My father was born in Brooklyn and moved back to, his mother was originally from Philadelphia. When she got married, they went to Brooklyn, and then they moved back after he was born. And my grandfather came from Ireland. So they were married very young. But they grew up there. My mother worked, and my father worked for General Electric. He had crews and men that went out and installed heavy equipment in the different counties in Pennsylvania. And they also worked 3 months in Washington, D.C., installing heavy equipment. And then he had a new employee that connected up the switch box wrong twice within 3 weeks, and my father had to throw the light, and he got the flash in his eyes twice. So the doctor told him he had to go south to a warm climate and rest, and or he's going to lose his eyesight. So he and my mother had been going together. They got married, and he left right away. He had a touring car, and he got on the train with the car. And when he got to Jacksonville, he got off, they had a layover, and he saw 3 men talking, and he went up to them and he said to them, where can I go to buy an orange grove? And they said, you can't buy one, they're too valuable, nobody will sell theirs. But we're going to Titusville, Florida, and out on Merritt Island. If you were in the service, you can homestead out there and start your own orange grove. So that's what he did. He came down to Titusville, and there was a ferry boat, sort of almost, maybe a little bit larger than a rowboat, and they had to ferry the car across the river. And he met John Johnson, who was a carpenter, and he got the piece of property on the west side of Banana Creek Road. And then he met John Johnson, who was a carpenter, and the 2 of them built the house. And in the meanwhile, he told my mother to get ready to come down. So she got all ready, and she came down in December, and when she got here, she couldn't believe what she saw. Chickens and pigs in the streets, wooden sidewalks, and the house was not yet ready. So she stayed in a boarding house with Mrs. Harper. And then when the house was finished, she went over. And then she found out what a grub hoe was, and they had to clear the property. And they made a big clearing around the house, and then they started grubbing out palmettos so that they could plant the orange grove. And then Dad finally decided to put tractor wheels on the touring car, and they got some of them out that way. They planted the orange grove. And then things were getting tight for money, so he wrote back to his dad to cash in his war bonds so he'd have some money. Well, my grandfather apparently liked alcohol, and he had already cashed in the bonds. Anybody could those days. And he told him, he said, you're young and you're strong, you got a car, go to work. So my father found out about the new equipment that was going in West Palm Beach.
was this in what period of time was this? 1920s?
1922 was when he came, in August of 1922. My mother came in December of 1922. And then when they went down to West Palm Beach, I was born there on the 3rd of December 1923. And they stayed there until I was 3 weeks old. And he had accumulated enough money to come back and buy out Leland Lawson's little electric business. Where that was located, I don't remember. And then He worked as doing electrical work, and then in 1938 he bought property across the street from a little business he had, and that's when he started a furniture store.
And what was the name of the furniture store?
O'Flanagan Furniture, and it was in addition to his electrical work. He had his little shop in the back for his electric work and the furniture up front. And then several years later, my mother had a gift shop. And then when they retired, they moved to Boca Raton, Florida, and lived and died there. So.
Now, meanwhile, you got married.
Well, in the meanwhile, I got a brother.
Okay, you got a brother. And what was his name?
Thomas Michael O'Flanagan, and he was a dentist, and he lived in Pompano Beach. He has 4 children. His oldest daughter is a dentist. The second one is a nun. The third one is a housewife who loves animals better than people. And his son is a priest in the Navy. And he's right now, at the moment, he's stationed in Japan. So my brother had no grandchildren. I have 1 granddaughter. So we all dote on the one.
Well, when did you marry Charlie?
December 18th, 1948.
1948.
And we were 12 days short of 65 years when I lost him.
God bless you.
But he was a special man. He was an only child, not a selfish bone in his body. Very generous, very kind. And I was very, very blessed to have him for a husband.
And you had a wonderful life
We
together.
did, we did.
What was his profession?
Well, when I married him, he was a national biscuit salesman in Philadelphia.
Oh.
And then when he decided, we lived with his mother and dad, and then we had our son, Michael. And I just said to him, I think it's time we look for a house of our own. And he said, who told you we were going to stay in Philadelphia? I said, where are you going? He said, I liked Florida. Well, that's all I had to hear. I could come home. So we came home, and he worked with my dad a while. And then Jim Finn took him out and introduced him to one of the men at the Cape, and he got working out there. He started in sequencers, and then he became a scheduler. And he was always happy that he had come to Florida, and he enjoyed being at the Cape. He really did.
Wonderful.
So he had about 20 years of retirement, so that was a blessing.
That was a blessing, and Charlie was a wonderful man.
He was. He
Yes.
was fantastic.
Yes. Well, tell me what it was like living in Titusville in the early days.
In the
you
early-
remember Walker Bridge?
Yeah, well, I know that the bridge was built, and they had the bridge tender had no legs, and he was in a wheelchair, but between he and his wife, they could maneuver to open the bridge when a boat had to go through. And I know when the electric would go bad, my dad would go out and fix it, and he and my husband both crawled out on those piers during a hurricane to fix it because the boats were backed up waiting to get through. So they had to get it open so they could go through. And but he was.
I think his name was Joseph Louisiana.
It was Joe,
Yeah.
Louisiana,
Yeah.
and his wife worked. But then when he died, the Osborns took over the bridge, and they wouldn't let Mrs. Louisiana do it after she did so much.
Yeah, because she used to do it right with Joe,
Yeah.
and she knew it just as well as Joe did.
She did.
Yeah.
Everybody felt bad because they felt she should have had the job, but they wouldn't let her do it. I guess because she was a woman. So the Osborns then took over, and there was a husband and wife team there, and used the bridge a lot to go to the beach. And there was when they were building the bridge, the wood from the more of a concrete bridge, where the wooden one was sort of being in use, but often it was off-angled, and we had a group of men that were paroling the bridge during the Second World War. And when they were coming home, they were asleep in their truck, and they missed the turn, and the bridge went over, and 7 of them were drowned.
Yeah, that was a tragic accident.
It was a real tragic accident.
Yes.
Terrible.
Yes. And then the bridge, when they built the causeway, the bridge actually became a fishing pier that Mr. Thompson had for a long time.
Yeah, they did fishing and shrimping. They like to get shrimp out that way too.
Shrimp was plentiful in those days.
It was.
Very much so. So
And
was
when-
the fishing industry.
And when I was a kid, when they were starting to put in Patrick Air Force Base, they were considering some property around US 1 and 50. And some of the townspeople said, "You can't do that, you're gonna hurt the coots." Well, the coots were like a small duck type animal. They were so thick, you could almost walk across them, the 7 miles from 50 over to the island. But now, if you see one, it's a rare occasion to see a coot.
Yes, I understand that the Benekes who lived out at Happy Creek, they had a hunting and fishing lodge out there.
Yes.
And they were fishing guides and hunting guides, and there's accounts that the duck hunting was very, very lucrative and very plentiful, as was the fishing back then.
Yeah, the fishing was a big industry in those days.
Yes.
And Mr. Scobie had, on Main Street, there was a pier, and he had a house out on the pier where they made, where the ladies had work cleaning crabs, and they would pack the crabs for shipping. So they did a lot of crab, that was a crab factory there.
Were they packing them in the wooden barrels? They had Scobie's had a barrel factory out there too that they used to pack fish in.
They packed fish in, and they had a way of packing the fish. I don't remember if it was head first or tail first, that they could get more in depending on which way they did it. But the crabs, I don't know how they packed them in some kind of containers, but I don't know. I never went out to see really how it worked. We had a neighbor who worked there, and she was an immaculate housekeeper, but her house smelled of crabs.
All the time.
All the time.
What happened to the pier? Do you remember what happened?
I think it burned.
Yeah.
I think it burned down.
Yeah. They had a fire out there, and a lot of it burned. And then I know at one time, I think it was a hurricane of 26, wiped a bunch of it out too, and destroyed a lot of it. How about the Walker Hotel? Do you remember the Walker Hotel and was it Carantina's?
Well, I remember that Mr. Waters had a shoe store downstairs, and at one time there was a restaurant there, Norwood had, and then Jimmy the Greek was right up the street, Jimmy Carantino's, and he had a fairly large restaurant.
I understand it was absolutely fantastic too.
Yeah, and he kept people, working there. One of my girls I went to school with worked there as a waitress after school hours, to earn money, And she said that it helped her a lot because her folks were poor. And she was a real nice girl, and she was a hard worker.
How about some of the other businesses that were downtown? Pritchard's hardware store, do you remember that?
Pritchard's was right next door to the furniture store. Further down the street was Ford. He had the same kind of a business. And we had a Piggly Wiggly grocery store.
That was on the corner where the museum is?
Yes. And then they had Florida Power and Light had a big business across the street, and a shoemaker, and pool hall. And they used to, at Saturday night, they would play music and and one was called Tarzan. One of the men was called Tarzan, and they played in the pool hall, but you could hear the music all over. And there was one family that lived, I believe in Oak Hill, I'm not sure, and they had a son that was afflicted, but he had a policeman's uniform, and on Saturday night he'd come to town and direct traffic, and that made him feel good.
Yeah.
And then at the corner of Julia and Washington Avenue, there was a call box that the policeman had on a pole there so that they could call wherever they had to. And Davis had a drugstore on that corner. He eventually moved it up the street and closer to the bank. There was a bank on over there. Mr. Ashcraft was the banker. And Miss Pepper, one of our school teachers, married him. She later married Dr. Clark's father after Ashcraft passed away. But I can't think of the other businesses that may have been there. But I know Mr. Waters had that shoe store, and it was I.M. Waters for his initials.
Do you remember Denham's?
Denham's was on our side of the street.
Or your side of the
That was
street?
a department store.
Yeah.
And it was, she had everything in there, Mrs. Denham. Mrs. Denham was Lovey Pritchard's sister.
Yes.
And Sophie Meagle was another sister. And Sophie taught dancing. And she had danced herself in New York.
Oh.
So she was a very loving character. She really was. Loved to entertain, loved to take people to dinner, and was a really nice person. She really was.
Do you remember anything about the Old Dixie Hotel?
Yes, it was. They had meals there, and people lived there. And I know every once in a while, we lived right on US 1, and people would come to town, poor people, walking, and they'd send them to my father because all of the poor ones were Catholic, and they'd come to the house and they'd tell my father they were Catholic and they needed to be put up. So he would send them and pay for them to go down and stay at the Dixie Hotel. Well, one night this man came, we had 4 kids, had a wife, and he insisted he was going to stay in our house. Well, we only had 3 bedrooms, my mother and dad, my brother, and myself. We all had a bedroom. So he took quite an argument, but he finally loaded them up in his truck and took them down. He said, you either stay here or keep walking. But they were, it was a well-known place. Mr. Titus used to sit out there, they say, with a shotgun across his lap because he had friends and enemies.
In the old
And
days.
he'd sit out on that old Dixie with a shotgun across his lap. But that's all I remember about that. And then it burned.
It burned in 1962, I believe. Yeah, that was a great loss
Yeah.
also. Do you remember Dummett Castle?
I do. My mother and father spent their honeymoon there.
Oh.
And there was mother said that they had rats there as big as cats. Mr. Murphy and his son were caretakers. And there was a little tea room out on the property. And but it was a lovely place. And later on, when I was in high school, there was a lady there that had done a lot of work in the theater with scenery and that type thing, and she had it. I think her name was Margaret Drennan, I'm certain.
Yeah, Margaret.
And
Drennan.
she took us through, and we got to see everything there. And it was built by a duke originally, and they had he and his wife had an argument. So he had his half, and she had his half. So it was really like 2 houses all joined in the center.
It has quite a colorful history to it back then.
It did.
Yeah.
They had an orange grove, and then Mr. Dummett had, I think, an Indian wife. I think she was Indian.
Yeah, she was mulatto.
And so, but they lived there too. Of course, that's who it was named for.
Yeah, yeah.
But the Duke and Duchess were ahead of him.
Yeah, they bought the
Property.
they actually built the
Built
castle.
the house, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember what it was like? As I understand, the 4th of July in Titusville was absolutely phenomenal.
It was. We had fireworks. We had, I know when my dad was the commander at the American Legion, they had horse races out at Sandpoint.
Tell me about the horse races.
And
a
that
lot of
was
people don't
fantastic.
believe that they used to do that.
They
here.
did that, and one of them was Edna Boston, who was part Indian. She rode bareback, and she had a long pigtail, and when she raced that horse, that pigtail would be straight out. But she could really ride, and she was married to Nick Boston, and they divorced. And he was told that he could not go on the property, could not trespass. So apparently he wanted to go back to get a calf that he had forgotten, and he went back to get the calf. She shot him, and when they were taking him to the doctor, he told him, "Don't blame her, don't hold her responsible. It was my fault. I should not have trespassed." So they didn't do anything to her.
And about what year was this? Do you remember?
It was in the late 30s.
Their 30s.
And my understanding was, now I don't know if it's true or not, but she had a son and a daughter, Frank and Edna May. And they said about 7 months later, she went off with Edna May's boyfriend on the back of a motorcycle. Now, if that's so or not, I don't know. But I do know I went to the funeral for Nick, and she tried to climb into the casket. That I know, I saw that.
Oh my goodness
So
gracious.
so it was quite a big thing in Titusville
Yeah.
to have a murder.
Good grief, I'd say. What do you remember about the theater?
The theater?
Florida Theater. Did they start out as vaudeville there?
I don't know if they did or not. It was always a movie theater as long as I remember.
Did they have talkies?
Yeah, and Tom and Myra Brandon had it, and my dad did a lot, rewired everything, and then they couldn't pay him, so we took it out and took movie tickets. And every time the movie changed, we were in the movies. And Mr. Poe had a grocery store, and every once in a while, his refrigeration would go out. He'd come in the movies and get my father out. We'd have to miss the rest of the show, go home so Daddy could change clothes and go fix the refrigeration. And then he'd come and get him out of bed at night. We had a one-story house, and he'd holler in, "You in there, Tom?" My father'd say, "Where else would I be?" "Well, it's not working. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I can't lose my meat." So Daddy'd get up and go out and go fix the refrigeration again.
Oh my God.
And he had 2 boys. He had a son, and then another of his son and boyfriend. And you go in the grocery store and tell them what you wanted at the counter. They'd run around and get everything, and then they'd carry it out to the car for you. So it was a really neat arrangement.
Very nice to have that personal service back
It was.
then. Yeah. Do you remember some of the ladies' shops downtown? I understand you had a millinery shop, a dress shop.
There was Mrs. Watwood had a dress shop, and she was a lovely, lovely lady. And you could go in there a half a dozen times and not buy anything, and she would always greet you just the same as though you were the biggest customer in town. Pearl Tyler had a dress shop there, and then there was a hairdresser shop there. My father owned those properties, but they rented from him. They had the furniture store and then the other 2 stores.
Do you remember, I think it was called the Davis's OK Barbershop?
Barbershop, yes.
Yeah, and I understand.
I can remember going there and getting my hair cut, And they'd put a board across the arms and you'd sit there, you know. And finally, when I was pretty tall. And
This is
I
when
finally
you were little. This
I
is when
said
you
to
were
my
little.
mother one day, I said, why can't I go to the hairdresser instead of the barber shop? I'm tired of sitting on that board. So then I started going to the hairdresser to get my hair cut. Shingled up the back and cut to the tips of your ears show. That was the signal.
Where did you go to school?
Titusville Elementary School,
And where was that located?
downtown, where City Hall is now. And remember my first grade teacher was Miss Conquest, and she had taught in Japan. And they had, every Friday, we had what we called chapel. And it could be some kind of entertainment, could be a minister, it could be somebody from the town who could sing, just whatever the entertainment was. But out of the lunchroom, they had these huge glass mayonnaise jars, and they had lids, and they cut a slit in the lids, and we were asked to bring in pennies to put in that jar to send to the poor kids in Japan. And I'm convinced they shot them back at us, because it was my age group that got shot back at with those darn pennies. We kept hauling over there.
To Japan for the. Where did you go to high school?
Titusville High School. We had first 6 grades at the elementary school, and the last 6 were at Titusville High.
Oh.
There was not an intermediate. It was 6 in first grade, 6 at Titusville High. So we started there in 7th grade and went through high school. And I graduated as class president in 1941.
Well, who were some of your
And we had
classmates?
a bad graduation. Nothing, it was the worst thing you could imagine. We always had very dignified, wonderful exercises, you know. This year they decided that we should have a play. And some of the kids were off stage. We did all of our graduation at the elementary school because they had a stage and curtains. We didn't have that. We just had an open dais at the high school. So the guys, younger kids were off stage screaming and hollering. They wanted to come in and graduate. It was the most ridiculous thing. And I thought, wouldn't you know they'd do it when my graduation. Instead of, and in the years before, we used to have, when they'd graduate, the graduate would invite somebody to walk them down the aisle. And I walked Herbert Ray, and I had an armload of roses, and you'd walk them to the steps to go behind the curtain, and then go sit down, and then meet them and walk out with them. And it was so nice,
That was
very nice.
Formal.
But they didn't. But they stopped it. Didn't do it. But they didn't never do that play business again. It was awful.
Do you remember what happened downtown at the end of the war? I understand when they announced that the World War II is over, that that people were dancing in the streets and.
They have been, but I was living in Philadelphia
Oh,
then.
you were living in Philadelphia then. So
But they were doing that there.
They were doing that there. Everybody was happy that the war was over. Who were some of your classmates in school?
Well, let's see. There's still one alive. Milton Higginbotham was one, and he's still alive.
Milton is still alive.
And we had
God bless him.
Bill Davis, Bunny Thorelka, Eugenia Thorelka, Harriet and Geraldine Rogers. We had 30-some in our class, which is a pretty large class for then.
Yeah, that is.
Billy Shoup was another one. I have a picture of them at home, you know, a newspaper article.
Yeah. Who was the local doctor?
We had Dr. Potoff and Dr. Adams.
Okay.
And
Where were they?
then later on, it was Dr. Christie
Dr. Christie.
and Dr.
Story.
Bill Bennett. Bill Bennett.
Okay. How about the dentist? Who was the dentist?
Dr. Lichtenberger.
And he was upstairs?
He was upstairs over at the Rexall drugstore.
Yeah.
So were the doctors. The
Their
doctors had
offices.
offices up there too.
Yeah.
So, but Dr. Lichtenberger interested my brother, and he would, when my brother would go, Mom sent us from the time we were little kids. And he'd take my brother back to the lab and show him things, and he got him interested in being a dentist.
Oh, very good, very good. And you were here with the start of the space industry. What can you see was the greatest impact or changes that you saw to Titusville?
Oh, I
at
think
that
it
time?
was the fact that so many people moved here. And of course, everybody was excited. And we remain that way. The excitement never seems to go away because new things keep happening, thank God.
Yes.
And I know that my husband went to work out there. He worked in sequencers and then he became a scheduler. And my son worked out there. So they both really enjoyed their work out there. And when my husband retired, he still would check with somebody that was still working, you know, because he still loved to know what was happening. But it was an interesting thing, and it was, I know he took us out one time for one of the shots. We got up on the roof of the building to watch it, and that was really exciting. We were allowed to go. He was allowed to bring us out there once.
I remember stories that that during the launches, the Pirtles, who lived over on the river, they had people come and sit along their seawall to watch the shots all the time.
Yeah.
And there were so many people here in town when we had shots going off.
Yeah.
You couldn't move for about 4 or 5 hours after a shot went.
You know, one thing that you talk about, things that happened when I was little. For Halloween was a big deal here. They'd have a parade, and everything took place at the elementary school. On either side of the sidewalk, they had booths. And then the older kids could have a sock hop in the gymnasium. They had to dance in socks so they didn't hurt the floor. But it was really an exciting time. But we didn't have trick or treat. I was 20 years old living with my aunt in Philadelphia. And I saw her getting things ready. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Getting ready for trick or treat." Well, then the kids would come in and they'd either recite or sing or dance and get their treat. And then people from other areas moved down here. They brought trick or treat too. So they began to have it here. But we never had trick or treat growing up.
Oh, isn't that something?
All the excitement went on at the school.
Oh, that's something. How about Christmas? What was Christmas?
Christmas was a big deal. Judge Newman always played Santa Claus. We all knew who he was, but he did a good job. He was very good about going to the different churches or out in the park. He'd have treats for the kids, you know, and it was really a nice time. Christmas was a big deal.
And Titusville was very family oriented back then.
It was.
And I remember other stories about the children growing up, and everybody knew everybody.
That's
number
true.
one. And if you were doing something as a child that you knew you weren't supposed to do, that your neighbor could correct you, and then you knew you were going to get it from your mom and dad when you went home too.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. They took care of each other,
That's right.
good or bad.
Do you remember the Boyd brothers?
Boyd,
Boyd, yeah. Gus Boyd.
they had a filling station, I guess.
Yes, they had a filling station. How about the night fishery? Night fishing?
Yes, I remember going with Lola Osmond. She knew everybody. Of course, she was part of the Osmonds that had the bridge. And she could row a boat. And I went with her one night, and she'd row around, and she'd know who the different men that were fishing at night out there. You know, and that was just the one time I went with her, but it was nice, very interesting.
Yeah.
And you could see the phosphorus in the water, you know, back that time.
Yeah, that was a lot of phosphorus in
It
the
was.
river, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And the river was very clear too.
Very clear.
Yeah. What was the beach like over on the beach?
The beach was just a beach. Eventually there was a building there and people sold beer and I suppose they had food, I don't know. But we'd go out, my dad would take us on a Wednesday afternoon. Titusville closed down on Wednesday afternoons. And if he didn't have something he had to do, he'd take us out there and we'd take our dog. The dog was allowed on the beach. And we'd go and have a good time at the beach and come home and have dinner. But eventually there was a building out there.
I think Sammy Hendricks.
Sammy Hendricks had it for a while.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Sammy and I were good friends.
Yeah.
He and Tom Popel and I did the reunions for 18 years.
I think Mr. Papel didn't he run the projectors at the movie house?
He may have. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I think
He may
said
have.
he did. Yeah. Do you remember going to the movies there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. What were some of the old timey movies? Do you remember?
I can remember. Well, there used to be a movie theater on Main Street,
Mr. Mandeville's.
and it was silent. And I can remember saying, "What are they saying?" to my mother. "What are they saying?" Because they'd print the words, you know, and I couldn't read yet. So, but then that one time when Merritt Brandon had the Magnolia,
Yeah.
we the one on Main Street was called the Van Croy, and the one around with its Brandon's had was called the Magnolia. And then there was another one that was on US 1, but it didn't last long.
I think it was called Mandeville's. It was about where Denham's store was.
No,
No,
it
in
was
that
on the other
area?
side of the street and further.
Was it?
Yeah, down. I've forgotten the name of the man that had it, but I do remember that. But it didn't last long.
Huh.
It closed, you know, after a year or two. Didn't last long at all.
Well, this I know the post office moved around a lot too. Do you remember where the original post office was in town? It was on
No, I
Main
don't.
Street.
It was always on Main Street as far as I knew.
Because I know before that it was on US 1 one time, and then it was.
It may have been, and I don't remember.
Okay.
I know Mrs. Cornell had it, and Mark Calder, and Mr. Watwood. They were the people that were in charge, you know.
Of the post office. Yeah. In fact, I think Mr. Cornell had it for a long time.
Yeah.
Then Phil Cornell. I think you had said something about transportation too. What was transportation like when you didn't have a car? Were there buses or taxis or anything in town
No,
in the early
not,
days? You just
there
walked?
was a taxi,
Yeah.
and or you walked. We had one family came to town, one of the poor ones, and he had a mule, and he was always called Jackass Johnson because he came to town with this mule and his kids, and he was always known as Jackass Johnson.
How about the telephone operator? I know there's stories about the telephone operators that they knew everything that was going on in town. Tell me about the telephone operators.
Well, Jessie Cottrell and Mame Scobie, and there was another one. I forgot what her name was. But they, anytime anything happened, like if you'd hear the fire bells go off, you could call them and they'd tell you where the fire was or what was happening. And if something exciting happened, you'd just call and they'd know and they'd give you the information. But they were real caretakers of the town. They really were.
They were switchboard operators. As I understand, you could leave a message with them if you couldn't get a hold of the person, and they would relay the message later on down the line.
They would. Yeah, they were great.
Yeah. The switchboard was over about where the parking lot, the Welcome Center is now, I believe.
Yeah, where
wasn't it?
that kayak place is.
Yeah.
That was it.
That was the switchboard, bell
Yeah.
telephone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you can think of that you'd like to relate to today?
Well, I think that Clark's Corner was a big place on 50 and US 1.
Yes,
And
it
then on
was.
both sides of the street, they had filling stations on one side, and in the back they had a lot of trailers. And they'd have the men that worked the filling station, which was open 24 hours a day, lived in those trailers. And a couple of them went to school with us. And they worked and went to school. And then across from there was a the Indian River City Post Office, and a little grocery store. And there was a pier, and on the pier was a restaurant. And we had all of our proms and our banquets there. And then if you were a sophomore and got selected, you could wait tables for the juniors and the seniors. And the year that I did it, it was a ship theme, and we wore white shorts and a shirt and a big sailor collar and a sailor hat and waited tables. And that was it was a nice thing. We really felt honored to be able to wait on them. And then when we got to be juniors, then we were there with the seniors, and we would have the banquet, and then they'd clear it all away and have the dance at the same place.
Upstairs, there was the dance hall upstairs on the
No,
it was downstairs.
Downstairs.
I remember it was a real popular place, and I think also that the buses that was a terminus for the buses coming from Orlando.
It was.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. And I remember when I was in elementary school, they turned school out. President Roosevelt came through, and he stopped, and my father and Cap Stewart were two of the Legionnaires who helped guard, and they were astonished at how infirm he was, really. His legs were in terrible condition. That was a big deal for us to see the president in Titusville.
Yes, I imagine. One other thing we haven't discussed too was the train service.
The train service was good.
Yeah.
I know after I moved to Philadelphia, I'd come home at Christmas time for a couple of weeks. I didn't take a summer vacation. I'd save it for Christmas. And it was always a lot of people around, and they had a freight office right near it. And but it was an overnight trip, and you had to rent a pillow and sleep in the chair, sitting there. When I was a little girl, when I was 9 years old, my brother was going to have his tonsils out. So my father and mother decided I should go and stay with my grandparents in Philadelphia. And at that time, they had a Pullman. And I was slept in the Pullman, And then you had a little bell where you could sit and call the porter, and he'd bring you a table or bring you cards. And of course, I was forever ringing the bell, getting all this service. If there's another kid on the plane, on the train, that I could play with cards with, And then coming back, my grandmother had given me a ruby ring that was artificial, but I thought it was real. And my father had bought Penrod and Sam for me to read on the way up and the way back. So I stayed in that Pullman with the curtains drawn and holding that book in my hand, because I was going to hit whoever took that ruby ring. And then when I was grown and coming home for Christmas, to come home, and I'd get off the train with snow boots, a heavy coat, and a big hat, and my father would just shake his head, "What are you made of for?" Of course, it was freezing when I left Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And come home, it was warm. So I had to get all that finalia off again. But it was an exciting time. And of course it was wartime, some of it. And meet all kinds of people, from all over the world. It was interesting.
Yeah. Do you remember Nelson's Deluxe Diner?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Mrs. Nelson had that.
Mrs. Nelson had that. And
Yeah, I do remember because we'd eat there once in a while. And when I was a senior in high school, I never dated anybody in Titusville. So when my junior year, Leah Conley knew two fellas from Orlando, and they came over and took my girlfriend and I to the prom. And then my father had electrical business, and he had a couple places in Orlando he bought supplies from. So he got two fellas from one of the supply houses to take this girlfriend and to the senior prom. Well then, at the senior, afterwards, after the prom was over, my mother and dad had been sponsors with Mr. and Mrs. Darden, and they went to the Dixie Diner to eat. And so I was with Dorothy and the two fellows. And they said to me, "Where does everybody go now?" I said, "Down to Jack's." And he said, "Well, can you go?" I said, "I don't think so." I said, "I have to ask my father." "Well, where is he?" I said, "He's at the diner." So we went to the diner, and the fellow went in the diner, came out, and he said, "You can go for a half hour." So we took Dorothy home. She didn't want to go. So I went with the two fellas down to Jack's, which is now, I think, is there a chalet or something there in Rockledge where it's haunted, the house?
Yeah, Ashley's.
Ashley's. That used to be called Jack's.
Jack's.
So I went in and I danced with the fella I had the date with, had one pretzel. The next morning, it was all over town that I was drunk. Because George Moore came in, he worked with Jimmy the Coon, the undertaker,
Yeah.
and when he saw me, he said, "What's happened to Tom O'Flanagan that you're out?" Would you believe my father was down there looking for me? And my mother was walking the floor when I got home. In a half hour, I only stayed a half hour. Didn't have anything but one pretzel. But anyway, it was exciting to think that I got out to even go to Jack's for a half hour.
Well, I really enjoyed speaking with you today, Helen, and reminiscing about your days in Titusville and growing up here, and you had an exciting life. And
I did. I had a good life.
And you had a very good life and a dear, dear husband, Charlie.
Yeah.
And I know you surely miss him, as we all do.
Yeah. And my son. I miss my son.
And you miss your
I
son
lost him too.
Yes.
But I do have a daughter that I have sold my home and my car, and I live with my daughter, and we're moving the 1st of May to Cocoa Village,
Wonderful.
a condo.
Well, many, many happy days
Thank
living
you.
in Cocoa Village. A lot of excitement for you still.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming today and for reminiscing about old days in Titusville.
Okay. Thank you for having me, Roz.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.